Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Laura Caroline DeLara. I'm the interim director at DePaul Art Museum, and I am so pleased and really thrilled to be sharing this space with you this Saturday morning for our panel discussion titled Reparations Now and Onwards, Voices of Survivors, Advocates, and Next Steps. This program is a preview for our upcoming exhibition opening March 10th at DePaul Art Museum titled Remaking the Exceptional, Tea, Torture, and Reparations, Chicago to Guantanamo, which is guest curated by Amber Ginsburg and Aaron Hughes, who are also two of our panelists for today's discussion. We're also joined today by our other incredible panelists, Mansoor Adayfi, Joey Mogul, Aislinn Pulley, and Kilroy Watkins, who will be introduced more properly in just a moment. But before we get started, I wanted to take just a minute to introduce the museum itself for those of you who are new to DPAM, and to really thank our incredible sponsors, partners, and collaborators for today's program and the exhibition itself. DePaul Art Museum, or DPAM, is part of DePaul University, and our purpose is to connect people through art and ideas that explore the vast range of human experience and expression. And we aim to provide a platform for innovative and often marginalized artistic voices with a program that bridges local and global concerns. It was, of course, with this in mind that when Amber and Aaron brought the idea of the Remaking the Exceptional exhibition to DPAM, that we certainly jumped at the chance to serve the artists, activists, survivors, and collectives included in the conversation, and to really bring light to this difficult but critically important topic, which really affects all of us globally, but also directly and right here in our backyards of Chicago. The project originally stemmed out of Amber and Aaron's ongoing Tea Project, which is a series of installations and performances that create opportunities to engage with local and global histories of war, torture, and confinement. Tea serves as a contradictory metaphor for imperialism and settler colonialism on the one hand, and human connection and international solidarity on the other. Aaron Hughes is an artist, curator, organizer, teacher, anti-war activist, and Iraq War veteran who has shown his work locally and nationally at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the Maruki Gallery in Tokyo, just to name a few. Amber Ginsburg is an artist teaching at the University of Chicago who creates site-generated projects and social sculptures that insert historical scenarios into present-day situations and engage present-day histories to imagine alternative futures. Both are based here in Chicago, and the upcoming exhibition and today's program itself aim to examine the local and international ramifications of state violence while also celebrating the creative acts of resistance and advocacy evidenced in the artworks of the torture survivors, activists, artists, and collectives included. And you can find more about the exhibition and the upcoming programs surrounding it at artmuseum.depaul.edu. I want to thank our partners in DePaul's Law Library and the John T. Richardson Library for their help in really brainstorming and visualizing with us for today's program. Support for this exhibition and its related programming is provided by the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and from Illinois Humanities through its Envisioning Justice initiative. The museum is also just truly pleased to be able to collaborate on this project with other organizations doing ongoing and really deeply impactful work in these areas, such as the Center for Constitutional Rights, Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, Chicago Torture Justice Center, CAGE, HEART, Reprieve, Witness Against Torture, Invisible Institute, the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and the Prison and Neighborhoods Arts Education Project. I do also want us just to take a moment to appreciate the immense courage, vulnerability, and strength on the part of our panelists in today's program. And I want to thank each of you in attendance for really helping to create a safe space for each of our panelists today. I encourage you also to, show care for yourselves as well in whatever way you may need throughout this conversation, as the content may be difficult and sensitive for many, but truly promises to be really just an enlightening and inspiring conversation as we think about our paths forward. We aim to have a question and answer period at the end of today's session, so we do ask that you save your questions and your comments until the prompt at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to my esteemed colleagues and collaborators, Aaron Hughes and Amber Ginsburg. Thank you both.
Hello. Thank you everyone for being there. I'm Aaron Hughes from the Tea Project. And first we'd like to thank Unite David, Laura, Caroline, DePaul Art Museum for the incredible support that made this panel happen, and for the upcoming Remaking the Exceptional exhibition and correlating publication. I also want to let people know that I'm on the second day of a fast with Witness Against Torture, and wanted to give a shout out to all those that are fasting and taking action right now to close Guantánamo. One other note, Mansoor Adayfi might be stepping away 10 minutes early during the question and answer period, because immediately following this program, he will be on a panel hosted by Cage called Guantánamo 20 Years On. It will be the largest gathering to date of Guantánamo survivors. A link to that program will be provided in the chat, and we just want to encourage people to check it out.
Welcome, I'm Amber Ginsburg from the T Project, and I'd also like to thank our panelists for being here and recognize the particular importance of having Kilroy Watkins and Mansoor Adayfi with us today. This is perhaps the first program to bring together Chicago torture survivors and Guantánamo torture survivors. The connections between these struggles are profound. We also know that it takes courage, tremendous strength to speak out, and it's powerful for all of us. And we appreciate that your voices create a space for other survivors who aren't present and help inspire movements.
This weekend marks 20 years since the opening of the United States extra-legal prison in Guantánamo, and we want to continue to make the connections between local policing and global military action. The connections between torture in Chicago and torture in Guantánamo is direct through police officer Navy Lieutenant Richard Zuley. As torture practices have circulated internationally and locally, so too can the craft of reparations.
Reparations are a gesture towards righting wrongs, a pathway to healing. Reparations are a technology of justice that needs practice and tending. This panel builds on the powerful local struggle for justice and reparations for Chicago police torture survivors and on the broader demands for reparations. The Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, together with activist lawyer Joey Mogul, who will know more soon, of the People's Law Office, drew up this speculative reparations ordinance.
Shared in the link and presented here, this artfully imagined legalese went from dream to fruition when the Chicago City Council passed the reparations fund for victims of torture by Chicago Police Commander Jon Burge in 2015. This was the first and thus far the only city in the country to pay reparations for racist police violence. We take inspiration from this important moment of acknowledgement and accountability by adding to this history through the speculative reparation bill for Guantánamo torture survivors that will be workshopped throughout the Remaking the Exceptional exhibition. And we are sharing today a link of a first draft of that document in the chat.
The first large-scale T Project exhibition in Chicago was at Lynx Hall in 2016. The T Project has always been rooted in the anti-war movement and specifically the work of Iraq veterans against the war. But the Lynx Hall show kind of marked a pivot towards making direct connections to local policing, particularly in Chicago. Many of the people who spoke during the performance series were rooted in restorative justice and abolition. Part of that programming was a day of imagining justice and reparations for both Guantánamo, with both Guantánamo and Chicago activists. And since then, we've continued to build relationships with survivors and lawyers, advocates and artists, leading us to today.
We're thrilled to have Joey Mogul here to moderate this panel with Kilroy Watkins, Mansoor Adayfi, and Aislinn Pulley. Joey is a partner in the People's Law Office that represents people who have suffered from police and other state torture, abuse, and misconduct. They also represented 800 people falsely arrested en masse at an anti-war demonstration in Chicago at the start of the Iraq War, and represent lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people with a focus on police and prison misconduct, abuse, rape, and torture. And this is only by day.
By night, Joey is a powerful community organizer, a founding member of the Chicago Justice Torture Memorials and Queer to the Left, and a board member of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. However, I knew Joey as an artist long before we met, as the author of the 2013 Speculative Reparations Ordinance. It's a powerful artwork that worked, providing reparations for some torture survivors, continuing the craft of accountability and recompense, and is the basis for launching a reparations campaign for Guantánamo torture survivors.
Building upon Joey's language and the work of the Center for Constitutional Rights, Cage, Reprieve, and so many more, this emerging reparations campaign for Guantánamo torture survivors includes a fund for direct financial support to survivors. As you all know, you can't always wait for the US government to do the right thing. On this 20th anniversary of the opening of Guantánamo, the establishment of it as an extra-legal prison, there are still 39 men detained at Guantánamo. In addition to this unethical reality, this imprisonment costs the US $380 million a year. Until these funds are diverted to survivors, we are supporting a fund for Guantánamo survivors.
Our first goal is to bring attention to the 39 men currently detained. We've recast 39 cups of the Tea Project that are ready as gifts for people who contribute $155 or more to the fund. But ultimately, we will create a full set of the 780 cups, one for each man who's been detained in Guantánamo, to distribute as gifts in an effort to raise $100,000. And there's a link in the chat.
If you'd like to contribute, we'd greatly appreciate that. And with that, we are so pleased to pass the mic over to Joey to introduce our amazing panelists for conversation on the successes and continued struggle for justice and reparations.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome and introduction. I am so honored and humbled to be here with you all today and to be able to moderate this panel of amazing organizers, some of whom have just persevered and through some of the most horrendous human rights violations of our generation. It's a really impressive panel of these distinguished organizers who are also all educators, dealing with very heavy issues, again, around these egregious human rights violations, and then grappling with some of the most lofty, huge, mind-bending issues of thinking about how do you repair from such human rights violations? What does accountability look like? What does justice look like? And again, what does reparations look like? And I just want to, before we begin, I just want to state, yes, I've had the honor and privilege to work hand in hand with Chicago torture survivors, family members, friends, organizers in struggling for reparations for people who were tortured by the Chicago police. It's an ongoing struggle that we continue to fight for to this day, both in implementing the reparations legislation that was passed in 2015, particularly in ensuring the success of the Chicago Torture Justice Center and creating the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial that was promised to us as part of that legislation in 2015. But there's still a fight for reparations for additional individuals who were tortured by the Chicago police, considering that that legislation was limited to people who were tortured under Burge's command. But as we know, police torture didn't begin with Burge and it didn't end with Burge. And so there are additional individuals like Kilroy Watkins who have not had the opportunity to get reparations, and they deserve it as well. So those are some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to begin by introducing the panelists by alphabetical order. First, we have Mansoor Adayfi with us, a citizen of Yemen who was held without charge in the United States Guantanamo Bay detention camps in Cuba for over 14 years, where he engaged in hunger strikes to protest inhuman conditions that he and others were subjected to. And then he was subjected to further torturous conditions of being forcibly fed. He's a writer and recent author of Don't Forget Us, Lost and Found at Guantanamo, which I highly recommend everyone go out and get. He works with CAGE, a grassroots organization that advocates for due process, the rule of law, and an end to the injustices of the war on terror. He's also a co-author of the 8-point plan to close Guantánamo that he and other former detainees from Guantánamo drafted about how we can finally shut down this egregious institution. Thank you for being with us today, Mansoor. Next, we have Aislinn Pulley, who's the co-director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center, the first center in the United States to provide trauma-informed mental health and well-being services to people affected by police violence. And it's a center that was created from the Burge torture reparations legislation. And Aislinn is an amazing co-director with Cindy Eigler in really steering and in guiding this new project. In addition to being a co-director, she's the founder of Black Lives Matter Chicago. She's a former member of the historic organization We Charge Genocide. She's a beautiful visual artist, a former board member of Insight Arts, and a go-to peacemaker in the city of Chicago. And she's someone that I've been able to look to and follow for over 20 years in terms of both her organizing and activism in the city. And we all owe Aislinn a huge debt of gratitude for all that you've done over the last 2 decades. And finally, I want to introduce my friend and my colleague, Kilroy Watkins, a Chicago police torture survivor who survived close to 30 years of incarceration in the Illinois Department of Corrections. He's a community activist. He's a public educator. He's a supporter of CFIST and the Chicago Torture Justice Center. And despite everything that Kilroy has gone through, he shows up day in and day out, continually striving to try to free others from prison. So with that, let's get started. So here we have two survivors of these egregious human rights violations. And we have Aislinn Pulley, who's been fighting racist state violence for over 2 decades. And I think, you know, we look at what has occurred here in Chicago. We look at what has occurred at Guantánamo and internationally in the war on terror. And I think one of the questions that comes to mind is, when you think about these egregious systemic human rights violations that not only, you know, were sought to destroy individuals, but also destroyed families and communities, the question always comes, what does justice look like with respect to your lives, to your families, to your communities? What does justice look like when we think about what has happened at Guantanamo Bay, what has happened here in Chicago around police torture cases? So with that, Mansoor, I'm going to ask you to start first. What does justice look like to you, or what does justice mean to you?
First of all, hi everyone. Thank you for having me tonight, and I would like to welcome everyone today, and also special greeting to my lawyer, Annabeth Jacob. She is one of the Guantanamo lawyers, actually one of the heroes who work in the shadow to protect American justice system and try to bring justice to American justice system. You know, when you look at justice as a concept, it is a life necessity. You know, life without justice, it will be broken life. So whether at individual level or a system, a family, a community, or universe case. So justice to me, it's not just to me, to Guantanamo, and because justice to me, to Guantanamo, it is also justice to Americans' justice system. So for now, we can say justice to me is the closure of Guantanamo, acknowledging the torture, you know, releasing the brother who have been cleared, and those who still at Guantanamo or seriously accused of committing a crime, they should be tried, fair tried before American justice system. Simple as that. It's not that complicated. So also ending the military commission that, you know, the that's still apply at Guantanamo to work around the American justice system, that people can get access to justice before American courts. So this is justice. Also acknowledging the torture that happened at Guantanamo and disclose what happened at Guantanamo that, as you know, the CIA tried to destroy to hide all the evidence of the torture that committed there. This is in simple words as Guantanamo prisoners at Guantanamo itself, because again, justice to Guantanamo is also justice to American justice system, because Guantanamo is a reflection of the injustices that have been within Guantanamo, as you see in Chicago case. So yeah, and individuals' justice to us, it will include other things, which was also, I hope that there will be some kind of legislation and American justice system that forbid torture, also forbid making or creating such places like Guantanamo. Clearly stated, no one's like the government doesn't have the right to create such places, because the continuation of the existence of Guantanamo, it gives some kind of legitimacy. And we have seen many laws and many rules by the Congress, by different governments that legislated around Guantanamo.
Okay, thank you for that, Mansoor. I'm going to ask Aislinn for you to weigh in next.
So I'm thinking a lot of thoughts regarding what does justice mean to me? What does justice mean in relation to torture? What does justice mean in relation to torture that's committed by the state domestically? What does it mean regarding torture that's committed by the state abroad? I'm going to be honest with what I think justice is. So people, I don't know if people will get mad, but I want to begin with Cuba and Guantanamo. Justice means returning Guantanamo back to Cuba. It is currently being illegally occupied by the United States government. So justice is closing Guantanamo and returning the land to Cuba. Justice is closing all of the Black sites all over the world, including here in Chicago. We have a Black site. We have Homan Square on the west side that sits right in the open. And that torture site needs to be turned down. But then if we're really talking about torture and all of the manifestations of torture, then that means we also have to tear down every single institution that participates in torture. So all of the police stations, all of the prisons, all of the detention centers. And it's really about a reorganization and redesigning of society as a whole, both here domestically and taking out all of the military bases that the United States has across the world means a whole new global paradigm of how we relate. So justice is an entire transformation of how we are living, a reframing of the current global order into one that is not based on the extraction of resources dominated by the United States, but certainly not exclusive to the United States, that then results in so much pain, death, and just unequal conditions for so many around the world, including here in this country. So it's, to me, justice is ending the systems that create torture, that create all of the disparity and death in the world today.
Thank you. Kilroy, you're next.
Thanks, Joy. I'm thinking like Aislinn here, the truth, have an opportunity to freely speak your mind about the issues of justice after I paraphrase the word of the late pioneer and civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King: justice too long delayed is justice denied. That ought to be echoed in the minds of all Americans around this country when they come down to torture survivors who remain in prison to this day. It even remains for those who appear to have the illusion of freedom, such as myself, who continue to go to court and fight the allegations of a pattern and practice of torture after numerous investigations that already confirm the torture occurred. Many civil litigations then concluded, civil settlements, jury trials then concluded torture have occurred. Former mayor of the city apologized to torture survivors. You have a political system that acknowledges that it happened, and yet you still can walk in a courtroom where prosecutors and judges will side with known torturers. True signs of mockery of the criminal legal system. They just totally can remove the word criminal justice system. I don't think it's been just to people of color in this country since the turn of, or since the writing of the criminal code, when it evolved from the slave code. It never had the interest of the people. None of the codes, right? You revisit all the codes, right? There's no justice in there. There's no equality in any of that for people of color in this country, in particular African Americans. Know it because we often been on the very, very opposite end of justice, right? And it's just been something that we've been living with for neons in this country. So what do justice mean is to give it a true meaning, legitimize the word. If you truly going to say that you're a country of justice and human right laws and fairness and treatment for all, then, actually put muscle or meat behind it, right? If your United States Supreme Court hand down a decision and you saying that that's the highest court in the land and it upholds the laws of this country, then stand behind those decisions. Don't actually go into a back room and come out with additional laws to undermine what your highest justice system has already confirmed, or any of the justices in this state of this country. And so I got to paraphrase another great pioneer and leader of the human rights movement, the late El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, in which he says that the Black people struggle here against this government is nothing new. It's not an issue of civil rights, it's an issue of human rights, simply because we have all these laws. We even have the constitutions and the principles, and they founded principles by the founding fathers in the Declaration of we'll call it the Declaration. But when you look into the acts of the former writings of the founding fathers, none of it's authentic. And I think that what Malcolm realized, nothing is authentic. You say one thing on paper, but if you don't enforce it, it's only words on paper. It's the only thing that give laws power is when you enforce them. And you don't enforce them, then you only have words, meaningless words. And then if the people producing the words on paper is not sincere, even though they swore oath to uphold the fundamental principles that's written in the constitutions and that's been laid out by the founding fathers and carry the best interests of our democracy, despite all of that swearing in, we find they work endlessly and overnight to undermine every American's and human rights, these principles that's been written. So back to the question of what does justice mean? Give us some legitimacy and free torture survivors, close Guantanamo, return those individuals to their families and their homeland, become a leader in this country on the issue of human rights, on issues of democracy, on the issues of freedom, on the issues of justice. That's what justice means to me. Legitimize the word justice by reinforcing it with accountability and hold the ones who violate your core principles accountable. The same way you quick to hold many people of color in this country accountable in these mock court systems that undermines the legal prudence of your own jurisprudence. Therefore, we saying that stop that. Provide true accountability and true purpose, and then we'll believe in justice. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you all for such rich, I think, and expansive answers. And I hear from all of you that obviously justice has not been achieved in the Chicago police torture cases, and certainly not with respect to Guantanamo. It does raise questions for me about how do you go about seeking justice, right? Mansoor, I hear you saying that you would like to see, the actors involved responsible for the torture at Guantanamo be held responsible in the courts here in the United States. And what I'm hearing though from Kilroy and Aislinn is that there's not a lot of belief or faith that the legal system here in the United States is in fact effective and a producer of justice. And I think that's something that I think we can say was true with respect in the Chicago police torture cases. While we've been able to use the courts to unearth information and 30 years later free some individuals and get them some compensation, I think we can look at the legal system here and say for 30 years it allowed the torturers to go along and torture unabated, undeterred, and held basically enjoyed impunity. So let me just with respect to that, I'm also hearing Kilroy, you talk about accountability. And I want to then ask just specifically with respect to that concept that I think all of you have raised a little bit in your answers to justice. What does accountability look like? And where may that accountability be? And so with that, I want to ask you all to think about not just local domestic laws and court systems, but do you have thoughts about the International Criminal Court or about the United Nations? Are those places that are potential viable venues for us to think about accountability? But I'll start with you, Kilroy. Tell us what you think accountability looks like in the Chicago police torture cases at Gitmo.
What accountability look like? I'm a natural born U.S. citizen, been here all of my life, and raised in American public school systems. I consider myself a historian. Even though I dropped out of school, I returned back to college, obtained a degree, and I'm enrolled in college again to try to pursue an additional degree. And with all that research and all that education, what comes to mind is the fact that we have obviously a double standard that often in this country is not spoken about, whereas that justice tend to represent the wealthy and the rich, and obviously the poor and the struggling class get underrepresented. That's been a repeated pattern that I have witnessed as an individual, and I'm quite sure that many of them, other individuals, agree with me of how this system work. I was listening to you speak, and you was talking about international court and international laws, and when we think about this accountability, do we consider that? And I always have, because as a historian, I keep up with previous wars and humanities around the world. And it was interesting, I found out that the United States pulled itself out of the International World Court when they was considering indicting a former president who drew us into war under false pretense. And people would say, well, he probably made a smaller lie, or they missed some messages up. What are the consequences of that? Well, we know that many of us have family members, and even Aaron, former war veteran, who was pulled and drafted into these conflicts, and many families was destroyed. They lost children that they shouldn't have lost, who was pulled and drafted into these conflicts and killed. Many of them is caught up for 20 years in Afghanistan and other conflicts. And one would say, what do we think? Do we think that that issue of accountability should been forced or pushed? And absolutely, I stand on the side of that. There's no one person that should have drew us into conflict that sent our servicemen and our fellow Americans into conflict unnecessarily, right? When there was not a threat posed against any of us. And so when you're talking about torture as well, when you target innocent civilians or citizens or humans, period, and you torture them, right, repeatedly, you're not bound, because many studies then came out that you're not bound to get truth from torture individuals. They're going to give you what you want to end the torture. And so you can't gather clear intelligence that way, but yet they push straight ahead with the torturing. And therefore we come 30, 40 years down the line where we living in a system in the backdrop of Me Too and the system of accountability. of people who didn't harass, sexual harassed or raped women or abused children. And what have the public demand? The public demand nothing less than accountability. That's what the public demand. And they have not pushed back on that. And they sought accountability to the highest level. When we seen Brett Kavanaugh had to go before a Senate hearing because Me Too made the Senate hold a confirmation hearing around his allegations during the Me Too movement. So they wanted accountability against the United States Supreme Court justice. We simply talking about torture cops, right? Or agents of the state who then did something so harmful against humanity, not just individuals. And it had an impact on humanity, this torture. So we believe they should be held accountable. Now, what would accountable look like? Well, you didn't march Bill Cosby in cameras and R. Kelly in cameras. And okay, but I don't feel more sympathy for my torturers, right? March and parade them as well in front of the cameras. Let the American know this is what we do to people that abuse and violate the Constitution and abuse our citizens. We not allow them to hide. We allow them to run. We're going to bring them out and we're going to hold them accountable. We want the American public to determine what should happen to people that does this in our society. The very same way that they say is for so-called criminals, right? The old society of debt. You owe that to America. Okay, torturers. Hey, America didn't decide it. You owe America, you owe the debt that you must pay to society, torture. So step forward and be held accountable.
Okay, thank you, Kilroy. Mansoor, what are your thoughts?
You know, when you talk about the accountability, it is one parallel of the justice, because it's another way of justice, accountability, basically. And in simple and short words, people who should face justice as we face injustice. It is only justice they should face the injustice. Accountability also means stopping further abuses, like the system, abuse further torture, stop further chaos. Because why in the first place we created the system? We created the system for the betterment, to serve humanity, to serve us, and for justice to all of us. But when those individuals start tipping the balance of the system, that's what happened there, because it's like a vacuum. If you don't apply justice in that space, the injustice will automatically take place. So the people should be held accountable and face justice, regardless whether like domestically or internationally, because it is the protection for the system we created, the protection for us all. This is, I think, this accountability face justice in simple words, and it is justice.
Thank you. Thank you for weighing in. And Aislinn, you're next. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
I have a lot of thoughts. I think, in the context of the United States, accountability often is limited to ideas around what is legally possible. And is then confined to a carceral imagination of what can be done with policing, what can be done with detention and prisons. And as the center of mass incarceration, where we have the largest prison population, the largest incarcerated population in the world and in history, and have designed it that way, their contradictions come up, right? So if we're imagining that accountability is within the United States context equates the prison system, the policing system, and we know that millions upon millions upon millions, the most in history, are incarcerated, and we know that Illinois and Cook County have the highest false confession rates in the country. And we know that police kill Black folks, and especially in Chicago, 20 times higher than white folks. And we know all these things, that our policing, and specifically modern policing, grew directly out of slavery. Then how does that trouble our understanding of what accountability can mean in this system. And I sit there in that tension and in that contradiction, because it is the system itself that is designed to protect itself. And when we fight to stop the horrendous pains, exploitation, murder, rape, torture, harassment, all of those things that the system does, we also are struggling, I think, and I find, at least in movement, to then come up with what is it that we need to replace this, so that we're not continuing the reality of millions of people being subjected to horrid conditions and early death making and starvation and all of the things, right? Because it's all tied together. The fact that, even at the beginning of the pandemic, 70% of deaths in Chicago due to COVID were Black, right? Which is directly connected to the impoverishment of access to healthcare that exists in our communities, that is directly connected to the closing of our clinics, and all of that's connected, right? So when we look at the whole system, what is accountability? It's returning to me, to understanding in some ways power and how power is distributed, and where is power being held and who is enforcing what. So if power is being held by the state in order to enact violence through policing, through the courts, through closing down and limiting resources to our folks, then accountability is redistributing that whole paradigm of power distribution and resource distribution. And it's empowering the communities, it's empowering ourselves to be able to make these choices, so that what we have is a facade of, we've come to, if we look at the long arc of humans on this earth, right? And we're in this small period of quote unquote civilization. We've designed a system that's really fucking horrible to the majority of people. And so it is within our wheelhouse to say, hey, we've really fucked up this really small percentage of our time on earth. Let's redo this. And so for me, it's really getting rid of the whole thing. And I think we do it, and we have so many strategies, and we fight about strategies, and we fight about tactics, and there's arguments to fight from within and from without, and there's sometimes benefits, and and sometimes there's drawbacks, and sometimes there's both at the same time. And it's really struggling to figure out, how can we break this mold that is designed to keep perpetuating violence and death making and incarceration. And how can we become better at breaking it and begin to build up our power so that we're creating something new?
Thank you. Thank you all for your answers. And I think what they illustrate, and I think Aislinn, you're really getting to this, is just, these are very complicated questions, and there are no easy answers. There's no right or wrong answers. And within all of your answers, there are, as you say, Aislinn, contradictions in how we get to justice and what does accountability look like. And so I now want us to start thinking about and talking about what are people's visions for reparations, and thinking about reparations as a strategy, right? As a mechanism towards trying to get some justice and trying to get some accountability. What I think though reparations does for us, as kind of thinking about it as a mindset, as a model, is it gets us beyond just thinking about who was responsible for the torture that Kilroy, Mansoor, you endured and are continue to suffer from to this day. But what do you need to try to be made whole after what you suffered, right? And I think what I found is, after working as a lawyer, as an organizer in the Chicago police torture cases, and I think this exists in the US, we were so focused on trying to hold the torturers accountable in our, as you say, Aislinn, within the construct the cabin to our imaginations of our criminal legal system. We were trying to figure out how to hold Burge and others accountable and prosecute them. And we spent so much time and so much energy focusing on prosecuting Burge and others that there were and we always fought for people who were behind bars. But I do think we allowed ourselves for a long time not to imagine what are other ways that we could get accountability, other ways that we could get justice that would actually center the needs of the torture survivors and their family members and communities, right? And so before I kick it off to you guys and thinking about like, what does reparations look like? You know, I just want to share some of the people that I've learned the most about reparations from is from Black people here in the US struggling for reparations for slavery. And, you know, looking at NCOBRA, that has been fighting for decades around HR 40, has always said to us, you know, reparations is more than an apology and a paycheck, right? And Robin D.G. Kelly, in this beautiful essay that I highly recommend people think about reading, is A Day of Reckoning, Dreams of Reparations. He talks about reparations as a way for us to dream and scheme the world we want to live in. And thinking about what we need to be made whole, or people need to be made whole, but what are the building blocks that we can create that can then fuel us and empower us to continue to struggle on for the reparations that people deserve, right? And then finally, I think, you know, what we have now that is helpful for us in thinking about reparations is we have the General Comment 3 to the UN Convention Against Torture that really kind of breaks down some elements of reparations to help us wrap our minds around. So in addition to, as you said, Mansoor, in the beginning, what does justice look like? An acknowledgement of the torture. Well, that's the concept of satisfaction within the UN Convention Against Torture, right? The idea that there needs to be some truth telling. What really happened, who did it, and have that inscribed into the US history. We need, as you know, compensation for people who endured. That includes financial. We need the concept of rehabilitation. How do we put people back to where they were before? Mansoor, how do we make it so that you can go back to what you were 14 years before you're incarcerated, right? To the understanding that that is not possible, but what can we do to strive to get that? And then concepts of restitution and rehabilitation, right? What are the services that we could provide to people to help them try to cope and endure and survive, continue to survive and persevere despite the most heinous, egregious violence that they suffered, right? So I just wanted to kind of put that into context and thinking about what reparations can be, maybe. These are some of the articles out there, but obviously not limited to that. And as Aislinn, you said, with respect to ideas around torture and accountability, we all have different definitions of reparations, right? But with that, those were some of the things that we thought about when we were working in Chicago Torture Justice Memorials before we filed the ordinance, was thinking beyond just prosecutions. In fact, did not include any elements of prosecutions in our reparations legislation, seeking it to be an abolitionist document, but trying to think about ways that we could center the needs of the torture survivors and family members. And so we worked along those principles. And then I guess finally, and I think this is one of the principles that we did not include in our reparations legislation, because I don't think we understood how, was again, Mansoor, this element that you've talked about, which is the commitment to non-refoulement, right? Which means you're going to not only stop the torture, but you're going to commit to never torturing again. How is that? That is, again, another principle from the UN Convention Against Torture that is part of a reparations model. Again, I think that raises very complicated issues in thinking about how we stop the criminal legal system from perpetuating the violence and anti-Black racism that we see in the US legal system. As we think about what do reparations look like, what do accountability look like, what does justice look like? But with that, I'm going to start with you, Aislinn. What do you think reparations look like here in Chicago, at Guantanamo, around the world?
Okay, I totally thought you were going to them first, so I was relaxing.
Does anyone else want to jump in then? Okay, Mansoor is ready. You're
Yeah,
off the
I will.
hook.
No problem. That's fine.
Okay.
I'll take the beat. So basically, someone asked me a question. So like, how did you spend your 20s? It hit me. I said, what 20s? I never thought I lived 20s. I lived in a hall, in a small box, and I just lived day by day to feel the pain they inflict on me. I grew up physically, but mentally, psychologically, intellectually, just deteriorated. And one day at Guantanamo, I was watching a TV. I saw a man in India who threw acid on a woman's face. And I was so angry, like at what happened to that woman. And I told myself, if I was in power, he would be punished the same way. So when I met with my lawyer, I told her, United States American did the same to us. These scars, we can only see them, basically. So I'm talking about like 15 years gap of my life. This is at Guantanamo. When you talk about after Guantanamo, it's more. And also there is also our families has also like another victims, which like people don't even like think or talk about it, the families or the victims. So when you talk about reparation, for the last few years, I have been working Guantanamo case. I have just graduated last year in my college, and my thesis was about rehabilitation and reintegration of former Guantanamo detainees into social life and the labor market. The point I want to say here that for Guantanamo, reparation for Guantanamo prisoners, it is complex, because imagine you end up like 10, 15 or 20 years being sent to a different country or a third country. You have no family, no friends, no culture, everything is different. Also, you face another way of challenges and difficulties and persecution and living in the stigma of Guantanamo. So reparation for us Guantanamo former detainees, of course, first of all, acknowledgement, what happened there, apologizing, compensation, because I'm talking about the practical things that will help the prisoners. They can rebuild their life and integrate into the society. I'm saying that based on my research and my interviews, observation of the release cases, resettlement cases in different countries. So until that day, there is some prisoners who still in jail. They were resettled, they were released in 2015 and 16, sent to some countries where they were imprisoned for 5-6 years. Some of them lost their life. Some of them still live under restrictions, like they cannot travel, they don't have any legal status, they don't have medical insurance, they have no access, actually basic rights within those countries. And there are also other cases who were successful in their life. The one who were lucky to resist in the countries, they have, the proper system that can help such cases. Also, although there was and there is no any kind of rehabilitation or reintegration program for former Guantanamo detainees, none, which make it even hard and difficult, to build a life. So in my case, in other cases, I'm talking about like our life. So it's kind of like hard struggling, facing the stigma of Guantanamo, being accused, interrogated, questioned, also detained over and over again. So reparation also needs to acknowledge look in the cases for the legal status for individuals. And the United States government should have some kind of program that track the released former cases and help them to integrate into the society and build their own life. This is, I'm talking about, of Guantanamo release cases based on my research, but in my interviews and study.
Thank you. I mean, and that's so helpful in just imagining reparations, because again, it's as you're saying, we have to center the people who are directly affected, which is both the individuals and families, and look at what they're going through. I don't think any reparations scheme can really truly be created without really tracking the specific and unique experiences of the people who were directly affected and how they were harmed. And so thank you for really spelling that all out for us, Mansoor.
Yeah, I would like to add one word, going back to be a whole, it's not gonna happen anyway, but you have to live with it because, for me, I have made peace with Guantanamo. I'm trying not to make Guantanamo to change me in any way. So basically, Guantanamo will become part of our life, whether we like it or not. The number, the color, the life, the shared life, the memories, it's not gonna go away. So I have to make peace with that. I live with that. So basically, when some people like they try not to talk to you, afraid of you, or try to stay away, or being harassed and so on. So I'm already programmed that this is part of my life. I didn't have to react to it. That's what it is. I tried to fight it. I tried to stop it. But not to let myself to drawn into it. And it's something like you have to continue to live to some time, maybe for the rest of your life, with this path. Thank
you. Maybe we're going to circle back to hear how you've made peace with it, because that's quite a profound statement. And I think that's something that people struggle with, until for the rest of their lives. So with that, I'll kick it to you, Kilroy. Your thoughts on reparations.
Before I forget, I would like to thank Amber and Aaron for this opportunity, because for decades, I often wondered why the voices of torture survivors here in the States and Chicago fell on deaf ears for so long in the public. No journalists, no independent investigators, no media outlets. During the time of Gitmo investigation and the conditions and atrocities that was occurring there, no one was willing to make the connection of, what was happening here was much, much, much more bigger than what was being alleged publicly. And it was occurring on US soil with alarming irregularity. And so I definitely thank Amber and Aaron for reaching out to tie and connect this bridge with this panel discussion. And so it can bring more awareness to everyone here in the States and abroad, just about the systemic nature of torture and how regularly it is used here in the United States against its own citizens, not only necessarily against so-called wars on terror or crimes or poverty, but in general. I think about reparations from a much more broader perspective, and whether or not it's even more authentic when you even use the word reparations in this country, because you still have many ones, as you spoke about, Joy, that talked about the promise of the reparations to the children of former slaves in this country. And economically, we knowing that this was not to be the most powerful economically country in the world if it wasn't from its free slave labor, close to 300 years. And so we know they made trillions of dollars off that. And what did slaves or the children or descendants of slaves see out of that? Absolutely anything, nothing, zero. Not even the so-called 40 acres or the mule. And so when you speak about reparations in the context of being a victim of state-sanctioned violence, how do you box that in narrowly compared to the broader perspective of reparations on a grand scheme of things? And it's mind-boggling, but I would have to agree with my fellow brother Mansoor there when he spoke about acknowledging, first of all, that it did occur. Acknowledgement is a part of the healing process. And then you set forth to draw out a map on how we go move forward to fix the harm, not by putting a Band-Aid on it or intimidating or muffling individuals to share their experience and their pain, but how do we do this in a way, and as the late Dr. Martin Luther King said, that it must be done. And I like the fact that in the case, I believe it was Wiggins versus Burge or Martin, Joy, you probably recall the case in federal court in which federal judge Milton Score quoted the words of Dr. King saying that we can't move forward on this torture issue until we use the words of the late Dr. King and saying it's like addressing a boil. You must cut it open, expose it to the natural air in order for it to heal. And the same thing when it comes down to torture or all the harm that American done and its racist bigotry past, sexist past. You must open it up to the natural air of human consciousness, right? With all its ugliness, pus flowing ugliness in the words of Dr. King, right? That's the only way we're going to clean this thing out, gut it out, let that boil get gutted out. Other than that, we know this boil going to return over and over and over again. And so we believe that we got to push those that we didn't voted in democratically to lead this issue, to opening up this wound with all this ugly pus flowing as the boil to address it. And then I think that when you're talking about individuals coming home, I heard Mansoor say, speaking about, they don't have no type of programs or anything set in place to help them transition back into the culture or the worlds of these societies. It reminded me right away, bells went in my head because I'm working currently with the Educational Justice Project on reentry for formerly incarcerated people returning home here in the States. And it's a real live struggle when you have individuals who've been incarcerated, let alone not even tortured, for more than a decade or two. And you open the cell door, as what happened with me, and you drop me off at a train station in an all-white town with Confederate flags, and the only thing the prison guard tell me is, I don't recommend you walk around in this neighborhood because they don't like your kind. And that was in 2019. So I was somewhat pushed back, like, what? You know, if I paid attention and believed everything I heard in the media, I thought that the election of President Barack Obama ended all the races in the country. So you mean to tell me you still can dump black folks off in all white neighborhoods with Confederate flags? That, you know what I'm saying? Then you have a prison guard himself to tell you they don't like your kind, and he came and he pulled off and he left us at the train station, me and some other African Americans. And then what was alarming was the fact that we found an African American couple hiding in the bathroom in the toilet area because they was told by a state trooper, they was involved with a car accident, and they was told by a state trooper that, look, we're gonna drop you off at this train station in this town, but you should stay away from the windows because you don't want to be seen in there. Those people in that area don't like your kind, so kind of stay. And they hid, so they hid in the bathroom. They were scared for their life until we walked in. You know, newly released prisoners, they felt comfortable around. And I said, how ironic, you know what I mean? If you listen to the press, we was the most dangerous people in the world, and it turned out we brought comfort to people who was afraid for their life simply because they race in 2019. And so reparations look like preparing a system to correct all that. And by one, acknowledgement, by providing the things you stripped away from us, an opportunity to a higher education, to housing, right? I think that housing is extremely important. Many of us face homelessness. I had to go to a transitional center myself when I was paroled. And thank God that transitional system existed because it allowed me to build a platform to communicate with community organizing and education. But that's a serious issue in the United States, formerly incarcerated people and homelessness and higher education and employment. So we think that reparation ought to include all of that, putting these individuals back on footings to give them a fair chance at succeeding in life and not simply judging them or mistreating them as we trying to relive our second coming, as I would say, in society.
Thank you. And I'm so pleased that you definitely are out here to share all of your wisdom with us, Kilroy. Aislinn, are you ready? Do you feel ready now to answer?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Kilroy, for sharing that story about when you were released and that experience. It's, to me, such a perfect snapshot of the reality of this country in so many ways. Yeah, I mean, I think concretely, in terms of reparations in Chicago, it's to expand it. We know that, as Joey said, torture didn't begin or end with Burge. And so it's endemic to the entire system, the entire carceral system. And so of course it's to expand it, right, at minimum. But it's also to encourage other reparations projects around the country, which requires, if our example is any indication, requires a movement, and requires a movement to understand the history of policing torture and how it works in each municipality. Because Burge was not the only Vietnam and Korean War vet who committed torture and brought it back to the police force. It just so happened that, our puzzle pieces here in this city were able to put together a movement that was able to expose, how horrible this, the torture ring was able to function with, with such approval from all the higher ups, including the mayor. But certainly he wasn't the only. Like, obviously he wasn't the only, right? Murders are happening all over this country continuously by police officers and by people who are appointed as agents of the state. And so, all of that truth, and it kind of reminds me, takes me back a little bit to Kilroy mentioning Me Too. But I think so often about the link between the way so many folks I've heard, so many torture survivors I've heard talk about the power of their story and their truth. And it continues to be where the system cannot win in any way. Keep telling that truth and uncover those truths that we are taught to hide, that we're taught to not remember, that we're taught to shut up about. Keep telling all those truths. Keep telling those stories and connecting the dots. The way that torture survivors here in Chicago were able to connect the dots with, this happened to me by the same cops. This happened to me at the same station. That's still happening now. There are still, in my opinion, thousands of people who haven't yet connected those dots. And we need to foster the ability for that to happen. We need to create space for that to happen, and then create space for, what does that tell us? Then that means we have a whole, I'm kind of repeating myself again, but it means we have a whole system that is designed to function to carry out massive, massive violence. And so, but yes, like concretely, I mean, I guess that's a little bit, more broad, but more getting, fine-tuning down to like tangible. I think certainly supporting expansion of reparations, supporting, we don't have a systemic apparatuses for people coming home in any real way. There's no real government support into housing. There's, in this new budget that the mayor of Chicago just passed, there was no reentry support at all. And I was in a coalition that studied that budget. There was nothing in there, right? But the police get like $1.9 billion. So it's demanding housing, it's demanding healthcare, it's demanding, and for generations, because the impacts of this, when people are incarcerated, even if we don't talk about torture, which is really an impossibility, but let's just look at incarceration, that affects the entire family. This is an entire family that is affected, right? So all of these reparatory elements around housing, around education, around healthcare, which are needed, also need to be applied and understood as generational needs, as paying reparations for the entire effect of the harm that was caused. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I think having these conversations about what reparations can be, should be, what we should be striving for is something that's just a necessity. And again, recognizing it's far beyond whatever legal system we have in the US can provide. It's also a mechanism that allows more than just the actors in the legal system to fight for and strive for. As Aislinn, you said, it requires a movement. I think that if we're going to have true reparations for these egregious human rights violations, we absolutely need a movement. And so I want to just pick up on something you said, Aislinn, that you were hoping that what reparations have been achieved, although limited here in Chicago, but that have been achieved in Chicago, would encourage others around the country to seek reparations for the human rights violations that they have suffered, right? And so my question now for all of you is, do you believe the Chicago police torture reparations legislation can be a model for the reparations that are needed for people who survived Guantanamo and for the family members who lost loved ones to Guantanamo? So I'm going to start with you, Mansoor. Do you believe that what has been achieved thus far in terms of the Chicago police torture reparations legislation here in Chicago informs what you're currently fighting for people from Guantanamo?
This is a big question. It needs like hundreds and thousands of lawyers to answer, to work for. But I believe,
I'm going to stop you there for 1 second. I don't think that. See, that's the thing. I don't think actually you need the lawyers to do this. I mean, you need maybe one or two, you can use a few, but I actually think we all have ideas of reparations and we need to hear from everyone from reparations. But so I'm sorry to cut you off, but as a lawyer, I felt the need to say, I think we need a lot more than lawyers. Okay.
No, what I meant, I mean, if you are going to fight the justice to apply that and to do that, not the justice itself, the people who manipulate the justice. So you need an army of lawyers, legislation, times, and so on. And that's what we are working for. It's part of the justice, part of the accountability, part of the reparation. It should be some kind, the program that can help also supply it is a very good step and initiative that also can apply for former Guantanamo prisoners. I think, in short words.
Okay, Aislinn, how about you? Why don't you share with us your ideas and how the local struggle here could inform other reparations fights elsewhere?
I think my answer is that it does inform other reparations fights elsewhere. The center has been contacted by a number of organizations across the country as well as across the world. And there's extreme hunger and interest in figuring out how this happened here in Chicago, and how to replicate it in some way, and specifically how to deal with consequences of torture in terms of from a healing capacity, which we, at the center, we maintain that our organizing is political and our healing is also organizing and our healing is also political, right? And so they're not separate things. So we sit at a really unique intersection of the ability to advocate for all types of things related to stopping and ending state violence, but also understanding the psychological, emotional, physical consequences of violence and harm that is from the hands of the state. So I think that the reparations ordinance in Chicago, it has been paradigm shifting. And has laid out a new way of imagining what we can fight for in terms of creating a new goalpost, but also in understanding the long-term and wider consequences of state violence. And that it doesn't just happen to the individual. It does, of course, happen to the individual, right? There's the primary recipient of the violence, but it also ripples. it ripples to the family, it ripples, it has massive, massive effects. And that's also part of its design. That it's a torturous ripple effect that is part of why it works and is and functions in that particular way. And so we're understanding, I think the work at the center is really hitting upon understanding the deep psychological impacts and effects of that harm, and the multiple ways in which that harm plays out. And as we begin, or at least me, as I begin to better understand that, that then is allowing me to better understand what it is that we need to be creating, what kind of societies we need to be creating, what kind of communities we need to be creating, what kind of governments we need to be creating or not creating. So I think absolutely, I think it offers a portal out of the kind of cop in the head, to use that phrase, that limits the imagination, that is so massively indoctrinated into the population in this country. It provides a whole out away from that into, let's actually imagine how we could actually live in a whole different way. So I think it's absolutely something that should be modeled, and that there are people who are trying to model it now.
Great, thank you, Aislinn. Kilroy, why don't you close us out?
Thanks. What came to mind is when you speak about this reparations and being a model, I reflect back on, I believe it's in the town of Evanston right here in Illinois. That was the first, I believe, who council agreed to provide reparations to its residents who they can show, I think, historical record tied to being descendants of slaves. And they put a budget aside, but also provided housing and laid out this program to help them to pretty much catch up after being held back. I think it's no strange conversation after it's been documented what redlining was. Redlining was all about holding back African Americans from being able to buy property, live in certain areas, communities, to hold bank accounts. So when you injured someone so long like that, you hold them back from even trying to pursue their dreams in a country that's supposed to be built upon dreams. You talking about now modeling, being a model for others, either in the other parts of the states or and throughout the country. How do that look? And so I often think of Evanston taking this bold step, and which they did for its residents, and trying to put them on even footing after struggling so long and being held back, and trying to get on the level and the footings of white Americans. And so I think that was great. And I think that when you look at the reparations as its original writers, Joy Mogul and them did an excellent job, because prior to that, it was nothing in writing or in verbally or anything, a discussion around the issue of what should be happening with torture survivors or these formerly incarcerated people or their family members or their communities. There wasn't no discussion. So I like that the writing itself, as King said in his Birmingham letter from 1963, when he said that you got to agitate the mind, you got to somehow do things, you know, his thing was protest, nonviolent protest, and keep it out in the media and let Americans see what is happening to Black children and Black people, just simply because they didn't want to be segregated or want to be lynched or what they want to be beat upon. And so when he thought about that, because he looked back in history and found out that was very effective as a tool. And so when Joy Mogul went about drawing out this reparation thing, it was very radical at this time. You know, I'm quite sure she got many people that doubted it, laughed at her and everything about it. And she even get a little criticism from me because I felt that it didn't go far enough. But we both, you know, with a history in law, we knowing that when issues as difficult as this one is presented for the first time, you're gonna have a lot of different ideas and views that crash, but then you roll out something. And then when you roll out something, then you can build upon something. So without that first step, it'd be virtually impossible to even hold this conversation. So I thank Joy and the people in office and a lot of community organizers for getting that first step off the ground. Now, my intentions is, since we are aware that the torture went way beyond Burge and such thing as a Beyond Jon Burge movement that I'm leading from a number of the survivors that's coming home that was not directly tortured by Burge, but many of those officers he trained and that he's encouraged to torture, that we sit down with those former organizers and the great mind of Joy to find out how can we amend the reparations to include many torture survivors, not only here in Chicago, but we learned that they're abroad. We'd like to partner up with them as well. Let's keep these steps building. So we got a first step, let's get to a second step. And if we get it over with, let's cover 50 steps, that cover every 50 states, and then make it international and something the international court can even look at and say, okay, we can model this thing because we're seeing that it's effective and it's a tool.
Thank you, Kilroy, for all of that. And I appreciate, thank you. I'm very humbled by your praise. I do want to acknowledge that the concept of reparations for the Chicago police torture survivors was one that was originated with Stan Willis and Black People Against Police Torture. It was then became part of Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. And I then, as a speculative memorial, drafted the reparations ordinance. And as you say, Kilroy, I never in my wildest imagination thought we would ever file it, let alone get it passed in Chicago City Council. So it was beyond my wildest dreams. So it's true. Sometimes, as you know, the former chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party used to say before he was assassinated by the police, Fred Hampton would say, dare to struggle, dare to win. I think that's definitely true here. I want to just, we're now going to move into questions from the audience, and thank you all for being here today. And I'm getting the questions in, but does anyone have any particular questions for Mansoor before, because he's going to have to leave in a second or in a few minutes. But I'll start with this question and from the audience. As Aislinn says, we have a whole system that supports continuation of this torture, and torture survivors need to be supported in telling their stories to help people connect the dots. But torture survivors today are no different from Holocaust survivors. And I know survivors today in the US who don't talk about their torture to their children and are trying to get on with building new lives. Suffering it alone, seems to me. What can help overcome that tendency to accede to society's desire to not see the truth, to not know the truth? And Mansoor, I'm going to start with you if you have thoughts about how to answer that question.
When I was talking to some brothers, like for my research, like some of them was willing to talk. Some of them, like I said, we cannot go back to this trauma again. It's closed. Some of them already tried to move on, tried to forget, they found also a life that can move them forward, and they don't want to bring this kind of trauma and experience, because reliving the moment sometimes it can be devastating. Bringing to the children, it can be, cause some kind of also pain, or some people, they want to represent strength to the family. And especially for Guantanamo case, I can see the majority of the detainees, of the prisoners, they don't want to be seen as former Guantanamo detainees or known as Guantanamo detainees, because this will continue to hinder their life. I choose to speak out. I choose to, they were scarred, so we can bring the truth about Guantanamo to the world, to the people, and to educate people about Guantanamo. And in a sense of that, make sure that it's not going to happen again, and to close this place. So sometimes you have to sacrifice. Sometimes you have to do something, it might hurt you, but if you keep silent, it will hurt you more. So for me, I love Guantanamo every day. You see behind me, it's like life. It's my second book, my next book, inshallah, Life After Guantanamo, because the story hasn't ended yet. And yeah, I almost left Guantanamo daily. We are working on the TV show about life after Guantanamo too. And sometimes you have to, your memory block you from going back to certain memories, because it brings, keeping talking about it or bring the memories or going back to them again and again, it's like accumulate. Then it sometimes creates some kind of depression. I have sometimes periodic depression from time to time because the situation I live in, or sometimes the memories that I go live them over and over again.
Thank you for sharing that, Mansoor. Aislinn, do you have any thoughts on how we can help bring truth and make folks both, I guess, not make, like, how do we make people see the truth, and how can we support people in sharing their truth?
Yeah, I really appreciated Mansoor's answer. Like everything in life, people are at their own processes of healing, who have survived traumas, and torture is no different. And the same is true of Holocaust survivors, right? And there's now been so many really important texts and studies that have been able to examine the multiple ways in which trauma, is particularly of those who have been held in captivity, forced captivity, like the Holocaust, right? Or incarceration in this country, or in Guantánamo, that we know that the way that healing is lifelong. So when and how and where people are comfortable enough to share their story or their experience is really dependent on their ability to feel safe. And so if they are not in a space, and as Mansoor said, people's bodies will let them know what they are ready to explore. And sometimes those memories are going to stay repressed or stay in the back, of where we hold some of our primal memories, right? When we haven't yet had enough external safety, stability, all of those things to allow those memories to come to our, higher parts of our brain that help us process and make meaning of things. That's all dependent on where people are in their ability to be safe in their livelihood. And so, to encourage people to be able to come forward is also about encouraging people to be able to live fully dignified lives. And that means everything that touches on, right? The ability to have a stable house, a home over their head, the ability to have, income or some kind of reliable source of income, where they can live with dignity, where they can reliably have food. All of those things need to be in place, where they have love, where they can share their intimate worlds with someone, right? And that takes safety. And so, then there are those whose part of their process of healing and is being very open, and having to figure it out loud. And everyone is different. Some people's processes aren't like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So we take people, humanity, right? We know that we are varied. And so what we can do to support survivors is to survive creating more places of safety and providing places where people are able to let down the guards that sometimes prevent us from being able to connect to some of those really deep wounds. But that will happen only when the body is able to know that it can.
Thank you. Kilroy, the question from the audience was, how do we make people see the truth, and how can we help people who've suffered the violence feel comfortable to share their truths?
I was paroled January 2019 after being incarcerated January 15th, 1991 and 92. When one paused and for a minute and listen to how long that is. And I have that conversation with individuals. I don't think the mind is capable of trying to impute so much time because so many changing events occurred between that time. And they want to really be supportive and understand where you're coming from. But that's just the incarceration part. When I bag them up and say before that, it started in a small room on the 3rd floor with me being caged to a handcuff to a wall and tortured by all white cops. And they pause again and they look and say, well, wait a minute, the story get worse? And I'm like, yes. And they was like, oh my God, this happened in the United States. Why did we not know this? Why was you not aware of this? And they somewhat I see these flickerings in their eyes in which they start going through being offended, but being hurt, but they want to be compassionate and they want to be supportive. And so me knowing that, I've got to be able to slow down what I'm talking about so they can understand that I'm not pursuing sympathy, right? I'm a survivor. It's nothing wrong to empathize with it. Same thing, you empathize with those of Holocaust. But they able to move forward on their lives in a meaningful way when they have their support. And I know as a face of torture and a face of being a survivor, that my voice is very important to help people understand how they can play a supportive role in helping other torture survivors as well as incarcerated folks. And what we go through from a day-to-day basis is a real life struggle. You don't walk away from nearly 30 years of incarceration and 24-hour isolation in a cell, and simply because they parole you one day, then your life is just all roses and flowers. It don't work that way. Every time you shut your eyes at night, you wake up believing you go back in the prison cell. Every time you hear keys shaking, someone around you may have a set of car keys, and you simply flash back to a guard that's gonna come and lock your cell door or open your cell door. Some of these things just sticks with you, as Mansoor was saying. You don't walk away with these things. You try to manage them, right? And you got to also learn conflict resolution. Fortunately, I engaged in so many hours of programming while I was incarcerated around lifestyle redirection, anger management, counseling, a peer educator, a paralegal. And all of that helped me with my transition and communicating with individuals, even when I got out here, to help them understand exactly what was my needs, what type of help I needed, but also what was some of my struggles, which I find very difficult to communicate because prisons shut you down. It make you rely just on yourself and trust no one. So when one says, how can we help you? You look at them like, I don't even know you, man. You can't help me. You can't do nothing for me, right? And one was saying, well, when you tell me, how can we come into your space and offer assistance? And it's been tough. I like the fact that, I went out 30 days and I met Aislinn and Cindy from the Chicago Justice Torture Center. They embraced me, welcomed me. Cindy, in fact, was coming to my court date with my moms. I lost my father while I was incarcerated a year before being paroled. And the center really stepped up, welcomed me in their home, and told me they'd like me to be a part of the center, and invited me to be an advisory council member. And I moved forward in building relationships and talking to Nate, who at the time was, a counselor there. And that was real comfortable. And I invited other survivors who was getting out and saying, hey, look, come to this center, man. You know what I'm saying? If you need something to talk about, there's other survivors there. You know what I'm saying? It's people there who can hear your voice and you can talk to. This is what's needed on a more of a larger platform. And so when we're talking about individuals trying to say, how are we coping with these things? It is a challenge. I don't make small mints of that. And many people often will say, well, look, you look great. And I have to remind them that physical appearance is totally illusion compared to internal damages, right? And so when you went through a lot of mental and emotional struggles, you scarred on the inside. And it takes time for those wounds to heal. But it takes a lot of patience for people out here to allow us to heal from that process. And that's what's been the most difficult thing.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Mansoor, I know you have to leave, so let me jump in real quickly. Two quick questions. Well, they're not quick questions, but you can take it. You can answer either of them or both. It's up to you. One is, how did you make peace with Gitmo? And second is, what can people do other than listening and contributing money to support a reparations movement for Guantánamo survivors?
I will answer both. Thank you so much. First of all, making peace with Guantánamo. First of all, I'm trying not to make Guantánamo change me or change who I am or way of my thinking or belief or anything. This is the most important thing. Yes, it's there, it exists. It's like a wound or like trying to heal, but I'm not going to let that wound like change my life or try to, change me who I am. This is the most important thing I'm trying to do. And also at the same time, not to be afraid to talk about it, or not to be afraid to tell the people I was at Guantánamo and to write about it, to talk about it, to educate people about it, and there is difficulties. There is a lot of challenges and difficulties of that from governments, from, people who are afraid of the system and so on. But also at the same time, try to understand though that, in order to correct Guantánamo, we have to face Guantánamo. We have to tell the truth about it. We have to, acknowledge what happened there. But we have to also, as victims, we have to tell the people, we have to stand, we have to, speak out. Second question was about, sorry.
How can people, other than listening and contributing money, support a reparations movement? The contribution will help, but also at the same time, we, as you know, like we have fighting for the closure of Guantánamo is really important at that point. That's what we need to do. Like during the 8-point plan about, especially about Guantánamo, and this is the moment where we are trying to do. So by the end, I would like to thank you all of you guys, and my Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. You have my appreciation, and I hope we can speak again. Mansoor, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such an amazing gift to have you here and have you share all your wisdom and knowledge with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Allah, assalamu alaikum.
Okay. So let me ask that then to Aislinn and Kilroy. How do you all see people being able to support a reparations movement here in whether it's in Chicago, whether it's around Gitmo, whether it's around HB 40, which is trying to seek reparations for slavery? What are your thoughts about how people can weigh in and be part of this?
I'll bite. I think this is connected to the last question, actually, or at least it's just still been ruminating in my mind, where the question was around like survivors and trying to encourage other survivors to speak up, maybe who aren't ready. And I think this is where allies, accomplices are needed. This is where the movement is needed. And that this isn't the way for us to move forward and advance reparations isn't dependent on survivors and their individual points of healing and wherever they are, but is actually a responsibility of all of us. And so that means to be a part of a movement, to be a part of campaigns, to be a part of organizing, and whether it's a specific reparations campaign or specifically around uncovering and exposing the reality of policing and incarceration in wherever you are in this country. And because it's hidden, it's always hidden. And just like with, in Chicago, our reparation story is hidden from the rest of the country and also hidden from Chicago. We have to fight to get it out. We have to fight to get the curriculum taught. These are huge, huge victories. that will only remain victories if we have a movement that forces it to remain so. So we need organizers, we need people who are willing to continue talking about this, continue putting and advocating for the pressure that existed and to deepen that pressure. This fight toppled killing people. What is it called? I'm capital punishment. It is result of reparations. It is a result of torture survivors fighting. That was how we were able to get rid of the death penalty in Illinois. It created the country's first torture inquiry relief commission that exists nowhere else. It's flawed. It's not funded. It's, there's all the types of stuff to look at and see, but it also forced the creation of new things. So we need a defense of this ordinance because the city continues to threaten to defund the center almost every year, and they claim that they've already fulfilled their legal obligation. So we need the political momentum to increase and to sustain and to figure out how to keep that and link that in with the other fights that are happening across the country.
Kilroy, what are your thoughts about how people could support a reparations movement?
I'll think back as a former law clerk or a jailhouse lawyer, and that question would come a lot from my former peers of what their families can do to help bring attention to their legal situation. And I learned in my paralegal course something called the Illinois Blue Book. And I didn't know how powerful the book was. It was a little small book, but it had all state legislators, they had federal legislators in there. They had your state representatives in there. And once one of my mentors, who was a former C number guy, natural lifer we call him, told me that, the easiest way to abuse or mistreat people is to keep information from them and stop them from talking, telling out what's happening to them. And he said, what you must do is turn it around. You must start telling these individuals that's talking to you about what them and their families experience, to start writing it down, calling people, right? And give them the people to call and complain to. So at that point, I took on the role to become the people's advocate. And that's after reading a book by Huey P. Newton called Revolutionary Suicide, which was very informative and educated, because he's saying that each individual must take on the responsibility of being an educator. And being an educator is you owe it to your fellow neighbor to educate and wake them up to make sure the community is safe. You can't do it by yourself. And so I feel that other than offering money is to also get involved by reaching out. I think Aislinn spoke earlier about the fact that we have a prosecutor that still stand by torturous cops who numerous investigations been found who have been repeat offenders. And more than 100 cases, even the Illinois Torture Inquiry Relief Commission, which is an independent commission, have found these cops to be guilty of these crimes. But yet we have a prosecutorial system that rely on their testimony, so torture survivors remain incarcerated. And we know that one strategy out of many is people to reach out and let that prosecutor know, though, we don't support that. We don't support that you ought to stand behind torturers. Excuse me. If it had been known that and documented that they are torturers, contact their state representatives. Also make their voices concerned with their representatives that, look, we want something done about this. We are tired of this hanging over not only Chicago, but over the country as a whole. These people is entitled to a life, their family entitled to a life, they're entitled to reparations, but they definitely entitled to be out of prison. They have been there since the late 70s, the early 80s, the early 90s. Many of them are sick. They're my former friends and colleagues, and they dying. They got illnesses, a number of illnesses in that place. So we just can't sit around and hope that the next person do something about it. We asking everybody to get engaged. and let their representatives know that we demand and that we want justice and immediate release for these torture survivors.
Those are really awesome recommendations for people, I think, both to support the Chicago Torture Justice Center, and as Kilroy lays out, there's still active ongoing fights to try to free people who are incarcerated, all people incarcerated, but particularly those who have suffered from police torture here in Chicago. I just want to throw in that, one of the biggest promises that has not been delivered on with respect to the Burge torture reparations legislation is the creation of the Chicago Police Torture Justice Memorial. That is the satisfaction that is required as part of reparations. It's a promise. That's the truth-telling function. That memorial will serve to inscribe this racist policing history into the landscape of Chicago. And so I would just ask that you reach out to Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. There are going to be several ways to support the building of that memorial in the future. We hope that's a memorial that not only inscribes this history, but serves as a space to educate us and help us further, fight on to seek more reparations for more injustices, including reparations for Kilroy and other police torture survivors, as well as reparations for people at Guantanamo. I would ask people to look at the eight-point plan to close Guantanamo, as well as to look at the draft of the reparations legislation for Guantanamo survivors that was put in the chat. And again, I think if you check out CAGE and other organizations, the fight to close Guantanamo is still very active and ongoing around the world. And there are people who have been fighting for it for decades here in the United States. And I think that fight just needs to be reinvigorated. President Obama promised to close Guantanamo. We understand that Congress prevented him from doing so, but that's a promise that needs to be kept. That human rights violation needs to be shut down. With that, we come to the end of this panel. I want to thank Kilroy and Aislinn for your time, for your energy, for your labor, for your wisdom and your knowledge that you shared with us today. There's so much for us to think about, and I look forward to having these ongoing conversations. I want to thank Amber and Aaron for putting this panel together, as well as putting this art exhibit together at the DePaul Art Museum. I think when we think about justice, when we think about accountability, when we think about reparations, what we know is true is that we need to have creativity. And we need to think outside the box. And I think this art exhibit that you have all pulled together, that I hope everyone will go check out and everyone will go see, will help spark our imagination, will help, give source to our creativity, and will again serve as a space and a place for torture survivors and allies and loved ones and family members to come together to really dream and scheme of how we can seek reparations for everyone, and how we can, in fact, build towards the world we want to live in. Aaron, Amber, I'm gonna let you all close out.
Just thank you all so much. It was so powerful, and it was really wonderful. Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Kilroy. Thank you, Aislinn. Thank you, Mansoor, who's no longer here. And thank you, everybody who joined us. So grateful. Just want to give a round of applause to our panelists.
Yes, Aislinn, Kilroy, Mansoor.
Thank you so much. I just so appreciate the opportunity to continue to learn and have my thinking extended, and it's such important work. Thank you so much.
All right, enjoy the rest of your weekend and dreams of reparations. Take care, everybody.